In Select Series 3, eventually you're going to be encountering more complex projects, and one of the things that we want to talk about in this video are some best practices or tips that will help you to optimize your design in terms of Select Series 3 so that you're not bogging down your resources or your computer in such a manner that making it difficult or in terms of long wait times. And so let's go through a few of these tips here to give you some ideas to think about. So the first one I want to talk about here is rules on corridors. For example, we have this interchange design, and maybe for example we wanted to add a key station to this main corridor. Before I added that key station, let's say that I needed to add several key stations. I can come to this corridor and select it and then toggle off the rule, and right now it is toggled off, and I can go in then and add as many key stations as I want, and it will not reprocess that corridor until I turn that lock back on. And then after that lock is turned back on, the next command that is done to that corridor will force that change plus all the other changes essentially that it queued up into memory to be processed. And so the rule lock and unlock activation is a very powerful way to hold off any processing until you have all of your changes incorporated that you want to make. Then you can activate your rule, and that will then in turn process the corridor. Every corridor will have its own activate and deactivate option. Another way that you can activate and deactivate your corridor rules is under your civil model in Project Explorer. If you expand down to your corridors, you can lock or unlock either all the corridors at once or individually. You have the ability to lock and unlock. The next thing we want to take a look at is how we can target plain graphics. The way that we've been used to doing things in the past in Select Series 2 Roadway Designer is on the property of our points in our templates, we would seek the horizontal feature, or called a drafting style in Select Series 2, and with a particular assigned name, and if it found that, it would automatically move that point horizontally to that location. And in Select Series 3 that is still supported and actually is being utilized right here. Of course, to actually pick that up, we have to add that as a corridor reference before it'll see it. That's something new to Select Series 3. But as an alternative to targeting a named feature, and we have this feature here, as you can see, EOP new, and you can see right now it is referenced by the corridor and targeted as a feature through the template. That is acceptable to take that approach. But having said that, the theme of this particular demonstration is all about optimization. So what I want to do is to provide an example here. Let's say that we are targeting an existing edge of pavement to differentiate between overlay and widening, and that edge of pavement may be made up of literally thousands or tens of thousands of PI points. Well, what happens is when we target that feature, in the way the program is written right now, is that it will have to scan those particular alignments or those edges multiple times for every cross section to find out does it exist in any particular given file. Whereas if we took a different approach, we wouldn't have to scan all of the graphics in the file to look for a hit target. And so as an alternative and a better practice to optimize the model, instead of allowing the template to target a feature style, instead one of the things that you can do is add a point control to the corridor itself, which is covered in other videos. But on the corridor tools, when you add a point control, instead of targeting a feature, you can target this as an alignment, which will have a unique name. And when you target it as an alignment, as linear geometry, then it doesn't have to scan all of the different graphics out there. It only looks for that one alignment name and hits that and makes it a much more efficient process. And so imagine doing this hundreds of times over a project where on all of those targets has hundreds or even thousands of PIs. It really will make a difference on a large job. If it's a small job, using the template to target a known feature name is perfectly acceptable. But if you know that you're going to be doing a lot of targeting of plan graphics and it is a large job, consider using point controls targeting linear geometry versus template points targeting feature styles. The next thing I'd like to talk about is clipping references, and we are going to mention this topic a couple of different times. But in this particular example, we have a template drop that goes through an intersection. You can see that I have it highlighted here. And one of the things that I did on this particular template, if we go to edit it, is I simply made a copy of the template drop and ran that copy from the end of each radius return and deleted the left shoulder and the left end condition. And what that did was allowed a common seam to then take place between the corridor along this main line and the corridor that was developed for each of the radius returns. In this way, we don't have to add the radius return corridors as clipping references to the main corridor. The more that you can avoid clipping references or adding clipping references to corridors, the better, just because it does require additional processing for every clipping reference that you add. And we'll be talking more about other options with clipping references later, but the purpose of this particular demonstration is to talk about copying those template drops and then modifying them to where you won't have the overlaps automatically, and this will eliminate the need for clipping references in those particular locations. Another point on clipping references, as promised, is when we're adding clipping references, we can do those one at a time or we can do them all at one time. And so that's kind of what I wanted to show here. Let's say we have a couple of driveways, and in a real job we might have 100 driveways. To add all of them at one time, we simply select our corridor and we go to add our clipping references. And I'm just going to pick this driveway civil cell and this driveway civil cell to demonstrate. And then when I'm done, I can reset, and that will actually add both of those at one time with one process into the corridor. And so that way it's a little bit faster than having to go back and add them and see all of them processed one at a time. Now, what you'll want to do is when you're placing your driveways or your intersections, you'll be given the prompt to select the corridor to clip. You can actually do a reset to cancel selecting the corridor to be clipped and then add them later as I just showed you, and that'll save a lot of time where you're not processing all those clipping references as you're still designing your corridor. Another useful tip on your corridors to optimize design speeds is when selecting your corridor, you're going to have different design stages to work with: preliminary, design, final, and so on. Use preliminary as long as you can, because that cuts back on the number of template drops that are in each individual corridor. And until you're ready to go to machine guidance or very fine-tuned modeling where you need a template drop to match what you specified, there's no reason really to go to design or final until you get closer to your final design status. And so use preliminary as long as you can before you go to design, and then the suggestion would only be go to final when you're getting ready to produce your final models, contours for maybe display, and as well as for your machine guidance control lines. Another useful tip is to only keep your dynamic cross-section view and your 3D model view open when you need them, and the same would even go with your dynamic profile view. For example, if I'm looking at designing my driveway and I need to see my proposed cross-section and my model view, obviously we can have those open and it makes sense. But if I'm coming in and adding key stations or something maybe in my design view, or targeting my edge of pavement with parametric constraints or point controls, I don't necessarily need my model and my dynamic sections and my profile view open, so I may close those, and that will help optimize things as well. Just remember that these dynamic views require additional processing to show those views active in real time, and so it's nothing wrong with having them open. Again, it's just another tip on things to consider, especially when you have very large projects, several miles long. Another thing to think about is the increment of your template drops. For example, if I look at this template drop in the quick properties, you'll see I have my final design desired template drop to be every 10 feet. Keep in mind the product will automatically drop additional templates where needed. For example, PC and PT curves, low points, high points, profiles, start and stop, super elevation transitions. All of those will be added regardless of what interval you put in, and that is set up in the design stages. And so keep a reasonable final design interval, thinking of that in terms of tangent interval drops. You could theoretically put a template drop every 2 inches if you wanted to, but imagine how much processing that would take. And so based on my design experience, I find every 5 feet is probably a little bit overkill. Every 10 feet is probably about right. I think for most cases, you will have instances in certain design areas you may want to be tighter than that, but just keep it reasonable, and that will help also in terms of your processing times. The last point I'd like to make on this is break up very long corridors into multiple corridors. For example, if you have a 30-mile design job, putting all of that into one corridor, you could imagine if you had template drops every 10 feet in a distance of 30 miles, how long it would take to process all of that. And so use some common sense judgment in terms of breaking up those particular corridors. One of the things I've seen done as best practice is they would have particular corridor files, say corridor section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And then what they would do is take a blank file and reference each of those corridors into that blank file so that they could see all of them in one particular model. And that seems to work out very nicely, where your blank file is simply referencing in all the different corridor designs based on those particular station ranges. So that's another useful tip that will keep you from having to go in and process one 30-mile corridor versus just processing the area that you're working on at that time. The very last tip that I would like to share in this demonstration is do not make your active terrain model set on your existing ground until you need it. For example, if I'm not working on my slopes but maybe focusing on my pavement and I'm not tying to ground, I can deactivate the existing terrain or clear that active status. And what will happen is essentially your end conditions will just stop at the edge of your pavement or the edge of your shoulder the next time that corridor is processed. And so now that I have that deactivated, if I process the corridor, it's going to come back and show that those slopes now are no longer going to be drawn, and what's going to happen is it's going to process everything much faster. You'll find that a lot of your processing time, a majority of your processing time on your corridors is spent with your end conditions. So if you don't have an active terrain set in your corridor, then essentially you're just going to be dealing with the components that are targeting, for example, your point controls, etc., like your edges of pavement. And it just really speeds things up tremendously. And then when you're ready to start designing your special ditch profiles and blending in with your side roads, your slopes and stuff, then you can activate your existing terrain and allow those slopes to draw, and then you'll be able to fine-tune those adjustments as well. So hopefully these tips will give you some ideas to think about in your design process and can help you expedite the processing speeds